Celebrations, the ceremonial of rejoicing. Colonial rule coming to an end in Africa's most populous country. This was Independence Day, the year 1960, the place, Lagos, Nigeria. These pictures tell of pride in self-determination, but there was a shadow behind the joy. Independence had been achieved despite the colonial legacy, not because of it. A legacy which now bequeathed to Nigerians a deeply divided country. It would be many years before the nation achieved true unity. This is the story of that colonial inheritance, why it paved the way for future problems, how Nigerians had fought against colonial rule but were still not free of its imprint. That day, few could have foreseen the struggles that lay ahead, but all knew of the struggles of the past. To find out why Independence Day was just the beginning, the answers lie in Nigeria's history, the very heart of its journey to nationhood. Well before the Europeans arrived, the area that was to become Nigeria had vast resources, almost 1 million square kilometers at the heart of West Africa. From Atlantic shores to Sahara Desert, and everywhere in between, a country of varied landscapes, of wild and rich vegetation. In the south, a vista of swamps and lagoons, creeks and waterways. Further north, the hilly terrain of the Jos Plateau. A contrast with the hinterland, giving way to savanna bush, merging into the desert. A natural heritage unique in Western Africa. But since early times, it was the rivers that shaped the region's commerce. The two broad rivers that straddled the countryside, the Niger and the Benue. It was here that native traders moved their produce. These were the arteries that made trade possible. River commerce, the lifelines of the region for centuries. People here were divided along tribal lines, with a history of great empires and city-states. Fulani and Hausaland in the north, Yorubaland in the west, Iboland in the east. But behind these broad divisions lay a teeming diversity of tribes and peoples, over 250 ethnic groups, hundreds of languages and dialects. Today's Nigerian culture was formed in the centuries before foreign traders came. Geography shaped its cultural diversity. In the north, the pull of Islam and sub-Saharan commerce. Structured societies under kings and emirs, providing security for their traders. Strong hierarchies, organizing all aspects of their kingdoms, regulating political life and social and economic customs. Further south and to the east, the vast Niger River Delta, with its more diverse societies, its traders traveling a multitude of waterways through thousands of tiny villages. Ruling the villages were councils of elders. There were no kings in these parts. The traders bartered with tribes in the hinterland, fish and salt against vegetables and tools. Further west, the vast centralized kingdoms of the Yoruba and Benin. Kingdoms but still diverse peoples. Throughout the area that was to become Nigeria, people lived within the framework of their tribes. Traditional rulers held sway over their people. In most cases, there were no problems of succession, and that made for stable government. These were the shores to which foreign traders came. First the Portuguese in the 16th century, but by the mid-1800s, it was the British presence that had grown the most. Not only traders, but explorers and missionaries also. From coastal outposts, They set up trade routes into the interior. This gradual opening of trade routes led to direct commerce between African producers and the Europeans. British traders were already infringing on the commerce of native chiefs. As trade grew by 1850, the British government was ready to intervene to secure its profitable centres of trade and carry out commerce on its own terms. In 1851, on the pretext of suppressing the slave trade in Lagos, British gunboats bombarded the city. The British deposed and expelled the king and installed their own friendly ruler. 10 years later, after continuing disorder, they were to annex the city by treaty. The British claimed the treaty was an agreement between two mutually interested parties.
I think if one looks at the treaty, and one always has certain doubts about the validity of treaties in the 19th century, but nevertheless, if you look at the treaty, you'll find that they were arguing that we must replace slave trade with legitimate trade. We must protect the Lagosians, the people of Lagos, from the slavers and the kidnappers, and we must develop this excellent site that they have, suggesting it was very much in the interest of Lagosians.
But this claim of mutual interest was an illusion. With gunboat diplomacy, the colonization of Nigeria had begun. In annexing Lagos, the British had forced their puppet ruler, Dozonmo, to cede them the city for £1,000 a year. It was now a British colony. The Foreign Office set up the deal. Many historians now believe the colonial power had participated actively in slavery before deciding to suppress it for commercial reasons.
The British came in the 19th century when they have changed their minds about the slave trade, and they no longer considered it economic, and they were at the vanguard of the trade against the slave trade. And it was then that they began to take governmental measures, such as the appointment of a consul and sending armed troops to bombard Lagos and later on to annex the island of Lagos.
For the next 40 years, Britain slowly gained complete control of the area, but it was the notorious Treaty of Berlin, signed in 1885, which finally gave the British the right to develop the Niger region as their sphere of influence. The conference and the subsequent treaty were totally European creations. They had nothing to do with the hopes and wishes of African peoples. The conference carved up Africa to suit European trading interests. In Berlin, the British had little trouble convincing the other Europeans that they and their allies had a right to the Niger region.
The really cynical aspect of the whole Berlin conference was that whereas the British, the French, the Germans, and so on have been dealing with several African kings and peoples and signing treaties, and in fact using the breaking of those treaties as excuse to mount expeditionary forces against them. In Berlin, they claimed that Africa was nobody's territories, that they did not recognize any authority, not even the Emperor of Ethiopia, who was their ally, and so on. And so it was by agreement among European powers that the whole partition process was undertaken.
The conference had given the British the green light to organize and protect their trading in the crops of the Niger area. The British wanted to save on costs of administration, so they asked trading companies to administer the areas where they operated. In the north, they were to protect the trade in groundnuts. In the west, the export crops were rubber, cotton, and cocoa, and in the Niger Delta, it was palm oil for European soaps and creams that made the traders wealthy. And so the system of protectorates took root in Nigeria towards the end of the 19th century. It was a system that was to further British trading interests, and it was open to abuse. When in 1886 the Royal Niger Company was granted a charter to administer its area, it was told not to seek trade monopolies, and yet it did just that, while consolidating British influence and control. The company, under Sir George Goldie, was accused of using its charter to set up a monopoly. It excluded local traders through heavy fines and fees for administration.
Another cynical aspect of this was that they were talking in terms of free navigation on the Niger and the Congo, whereas in fact Goldie, who was the one running around, was in fact at that particular time busy consolidating his monopoly and excluding even African traders who had pioneered the trade on the Niger, so that by the end of this, he managed to obtain a charter to run the place and to the exclusion of everybody else.
By now, many Nigerian chiefs were under pressure to sign treaties accepting British rule. British representatives would depose chiefs who refused to cooperate. But there was opposition, as local rulers sought to protect their trading interests. The story of Jar Jar of Opobo symbolized the repression faced by native rulers who refused to toe the line, but it also showed the depth of resistance. Jar Jar's business acumen annoyed the British.
He was so shrewd a trader that he very easily took a lot of the markets that Bonny chiefs used to run, and he proceeded to establish his own sphere of trade, and proceeded to exclude all the British traders who would not deal directly with him and wanted to either deal with the other houses in Bonny or wanted to themselves to go to trade directly with the people. And it was because of this that he fell foul of the British, and he was tricked on board a ship and taken to Ghana and to the Gold Coast, where he was tried and exiled.
Jar Jar was never to see his homeland again. When he was finally allowed to return home, he died en route. The influence of the British was growing. The southern protectorates coalesced into political units. By the 1890s, they had rudimentary governments. They had customs departments, medical and postal services, and even a small army. And yet the most violent resistance in the south was still to come, from Oba Ovanramwen of Benin. The British provoked him. He fought back. He was captured and exiled, his palace ransacked, his kingdom the last to fall to the British in southern Nigeria. Even chiefs who thought they could work with the British ended up opposing them.
Some accepted British to sign agreements with the British, perhaps because their enemies were opposing the British and so on. Even some of those, like the rulers of Ibadan, the Egba, or the ruler of Oyo, who accepted a treaty, found that they had to face British military power later on. So you might as well, have resisted from the beginning.
In the early 1900s, the protectorates were reduced to two, to further streamline administration as the pace of colonial expansion quickened. It was Sir Frederick Lugard, employee of the Royal Niger Company, later High Commissioner, who seized control of northern Nigeria. He claimed local rulers had broken trading agreements. He deposed the emirs of Nupe and Yola and replaced them with friendly rulers. With his expeditionary force, he took control of Kano, then Sokoto. The Sultan of Sokoto, Atahiru, escaped. He was pursued by the British 900 kilometers to Burmi. There, Atahiru was defeated and killed. The huge Sokoto Caliphate in the north was now under British control. Colonization of Nigeria was now complete. Lugard and other British officials were now ruling through traditional authorities. They simply didn't have enough staff nor money to rule directly. This system of indirect rule worked best in the north, where the High Commissioner actually appointed emirs. The British cloaked its economic expediency with moral justifications.
I think it's true to say there is a moral element in this, a sincere belief that it is better to allow Nigerians to continue to live under the way in which they have been used, the kind of rulers that they have been used to having.
In 1914, Lugard was also behind the amalgamation of the northern and southern protectorates into a single entity, Nigeria. No Nigerians were consulted, and the British had no desire to unify them. They did want to simplify administration and allow the north to share in the trading wealth of the south. Unifying the railway system had been one important motive, and long a dream of Lugard's, to open up the north and increase trade by linking the two competing railway lines. One line was being extended to Kano and Baro on the Niger. It would eventually link with another from Port Harcourt. Amalgamation made commercial sense, but it did Nigerians no favors.
The basic thing was that its objectives were limited to British interests, namely to govern these people as cheaply as possible.
Lugard developed an expedient but divisive form of colonial rule. Despite the amalgamation, he didn't set up a central administration. The north and south remained regionalized under separate lieutenant governors. Western influence was particularly divisive in education, spread through the south by mission schools. Their academic instruction took no account of African values. However, in the north, the traditional system of Quranic institutions continued as before. These differences in education further divided north from south.
The early missionaries were not allowed at all in the north to operate. So the Christian missions had no opportunity of operating in the north. They were allowed free access in the west. Therefore, it was easy for Quranic schools to start in the north. Quranic schools, which were schools along with their religion, it was easy. Something which they had been doing before and which at the material time became a system which had to be given force of law. Whereas in the south, the missionaries had already started evangelization. And along with evangelization, they started schools. Schools to train evangelists, ministers of religions, and clerks and things like that. So all the various missions, the Catholics, the Anglicans, the Methodists, and so on, they started their schools. So between us here and the north, there were two separate systems.
After the turn of the century, the various peoples of Nigeria mixed in the new towns that grew with trade and administration. But with the British had come bureaucracy and a need to identify people to meet official classifications. This labeling would underline divisions within Nigerian society. Diverse people were encouraged to think of themselves in terms of the main tribal groupings.
The colonial system itself certainly encouraged people to identify themselves as Yoruba. I mean, you have to fill forms and declare what your tribe was. And, you know, in those places, the ethnic identities, and there were usually new types of identities that were came with the necessities of the colonial period. Many of the urban areas were mixed, but people within those urban areas identified themselves at different levels. But when it came to a place like Lagos, when the Yoruba had to confront the Igbo in competition for jobs and so on, then you identify yourself as Yoruba and the Igbo as Igbo, and you know that those kinds of identities became much sharper and much more confrontational as the colonial period wore on.
After 1914, traditional society came to be transformed by Western influences. In the north, Lugard now introduced indirect rule on a large scale. There, the emirs remained responsible for tax collection and the courts in a traditional structured society. Elsewhere, the system worked for a time through paramount chiefs, but where there were no such rulers, the British simply created them. These warrant chiefs commanded little respect. Popular resentment grew while the British were now reaping the financial rewards of amalgamation.
Let me just stress the fact that, of course, it was a typical example of British colonial policy, which continued right until 1949 to the Colonial Development and Welfare Acts, that every colony must pay for itself. Nobody's going to get an imperial grant in aid, which Northern Nigeria was getting. So if you put these two protectorates together, you're going to save manpower, you're going to make it more economically viable. This would be one of the real rationalizations of it.
But the British administration paid no heed to the wishes of Nigerians.
Expectations. There was no idea of consulting with Nigerians as Nigerians, or not even with southern Nigerians or northern Nigerians.
In 1914, the Ijemo massacre was to be a symptom of the deep resentments caused by the British. By treaty, the Abeokuta area in the west had remained a semi-independent state. Lugard wanted to change that. The death of a local dissident in prison gave him the opening he needed. After angry demonstrators took to the streets, troops were called out from Lagos. They opened fire and many civilians were killed. Lugard now argued that a local government which had to depend on troops from Lagos to maintain order simply wasn't capable of self-rule. So he broke the treaty governing the status of Abeokuta and brought it into the protectorate system. The incident typified colonial cynicism. Any resistance was seen as a pretext for strengthening British control. The autonomy of the North grew, even while in the South indirect rule provoked resentment. By now, British officials were emphasizing the North-South differences. This attitude of divide and rule was to damage the future process of nation-building. The consolidation of powers in the hands of an elite was to sow the seeds of future abuse. In the East, warrant chiefs were proving so unpopular that the British had to resort increasingly to direct rule. And yet, after the First World War, a national consciousness slowly began to emerge, a growing sense of national identity. Despite the divisions nurtured by the colonial power, the creation of a single Nigeria was giving birth to a nascent nationalism. The new nationalists were no longer thinking in tribal terms. They didn't yet seek independence for Nigeria, but they were demanding a say in running their own country. The first movements were Pan-African, grouping the separate nationalisms of different African colonies. Accra, Ghana, 1920, the site of the founding of the National Congress of British West Africa. It demanded that Africans should sit on legislative councils in each British West African territory, including Nigeria. Among those attending the founding conference was the Nigerian nationalist Herbert Macaulay. These early nationalists were roundly denounced. The Governor-General at the time, Sir Hugh Clifford, believed a centralized nation could never integrate Nigeria's diversity. In a speech, he attacked the idea of a unified Nigeria in terms that were a pretext for the continued policy of divide and rule. Assuming that the impossible were feasible, that this collection of self-contained and mutually independent native states separated from one another, as many of them are by great distances, by differences of history and traditions, and by ethnological, racial, tribal, political, social and religious barriers, were indeed capable of being welded into a single homogeneous nation, a deadly blow would thereby be struck at the very root of national self-government in Nigeria, which secures to each separate people the right to maintain its identity, its individuality, its own chosen form of government, and the peculiar political and social institutions which have been evolved for it by the wisdom and by the accumulated experience of generations of its forebears. Shortly after this speech in 1922, Clifford did introduce a new constitution. It entitled Africans to 3 seats on the 46-member Lagos Legislative Council. Some historians still claim that this represented a genuine change of heart by Clifford, a colonial change of attitude.
in which there is talk of the sacred trust of colonies. There is talk about the responsibility of colonial powers being to hold people's hands, and then the actual word, until they can stand on their own feet. Paternalistic, if you like, very, but nevertheless a move suggesting that after World War I, the whole questioning of what colonies is about is being looked at under, if you like, the remote but nevertheless real eye of the League of Nations.
But Clifford's meagre concessions were, to most observers, nothing more than a sop to nationalist opinion at the time.
I don't think he changed his mind. If he did, there wasn't much evidence, even in that constitution, that he foresaw Nigeria as one political entity within the foreseeable future.
Nevertheless, it was the prospect of seats on the Lagos Council that led Herbert Macaulay to form the Nigerian National Democratic Party. The NNDP took all the seats in the 1923 elections in Lagos and again in 28 and 33. Macaulay was a gifted orator, and he'd continually challenged the colonial administration over local issues in Lagos. By the 1930s, his stand was to pave the way for a new nationalist movement. The Lagos Youth Movement was the first to demand self-determination. It was founded by Dr. Nnamdi Azikiwe.
I introduced the idea of one Nigeria, one Nigeria. And what happened was that in 1938, as I was explaining earlier on, it was the Lagos Youth Movement. So I appealed to my colleagues that Lagos was all right. Yes, Lagos is the basis, is the capital, is the capital of Nigeria. And Lagos also is the homeland of many multilingual groups in Nigeria. So that Lagos Youth Movement was all right. But what we wanted was to create a spirit of nationalism. And so we should change it from Lagos Youth Movement to Nigerian Youth Movement. It was agreed.
By the 1940s, there was still little communication between educated Nigerians and the colonial government. For the British, seeking out friendship with a Nigerian was considered unsound behavior. Nigerians may have been working daily alongside the British, but that didn't stop them being banned from bars and clubs, a practice which continued up until the 1950s. The British had problems relating to the very people they claimed they'd educated to such a high standard. One British schoolteacher in those early days was Jean Boyd.
I went to dinner parties with the senior district officers and other members of what was then the establishment, and I never met any Nigerians there at all.
World War II was to change attitudes. Many Nigerians fought alongside people from other nations. They experienced the egalitarian influence of war. They absorbed the language of freedom and justice used to fight the oppression of dictatorships. At home and abroad, Nigerian soldiers served as equals together with Europeans. Barriers had broken down under the stress of conflict. After the war, it would be hard to accept the old divisions. A new set of horizons opened, one that included an independent Nigeria. Nigerians felt they'd invested in Britain's war effort. Now Britain should invest in their aspirations.
So we felt that we were not saying something that was strange. It was consistent with the announced policy of the Allied powers that all peoples were entitled to the right of self-determination. But when we were denied such right, we said, no, it couldn't be a government headed by Sir Winston Churchill, because he was present with Roosevelt and Stalin when the Atlantic Charter was prepared. So on that basis, we prepared a blueprint for 15 years to enable Britain to hand over to us over a period of 15 years.
But for Nigerians everywhere, persuading the British would be an uphill task.
I mean, the nationalists knew that they had to fight the British every inch of the way. What I think was significant was that once the nationalists showed that they were able to unite, at least convey the impression that they were willing to work together, the British held out the possibility of power to them.
And so it happened. After a split in the Nigerian youth movement, a new and more cohesive nationalist party was founded, led by Dr. Azikiwe and Herbert Macaulay, the National Council of Nigeria and the Cameroons, the NCNC.
It was decided that we wanted an organization which would be national in outlook, and you should emphasize one country.
Meanwhile, Nigeria's involvement in the war had led to increased demand for her raw materials by the Allies. The country's exports doubled. But even during the war, the British seemed interested in promoting trade that would benefit them rather than Nigeria's economic development. So cash crops were exported to industrialized Britain, but the British didn't develop Nigerian farming, nor did they start any industry. In all, they contributed little to economic growth, whatever their stated policies.
The British, obviously, in claiming that the colonial period was a period of development, it is certainly not true. Because, in fact, even in terms of policy, let alone implementation, they did not pass the Colonial Development and Welfare Act until 1944. And it's only after the Second World War that law and order, as the basic aim of colonial administration, began to give way to some concept of development.
This lack of concern with Nigerian needs was made clear in 1944. The Governor-General, Sir Arthur Richards, proposed a new constitution which would be enacted 3 years later. Although it brought the North into the central legislature, it also set up separate regional councils for the North, East and West. The nationalists were bitterly against the constitution. They said it was being imposed without consulting Nigerians. They attacked the idea of regional councils without legislative powers. As they saw it, it didn't seem much of a step towards self-determination. Dr. Azikiwe led an NCNC protest delegation to London with members from all over Nigeria.
To the United Kingdom as delegates of the National Council of Nigeria and the Cameroons, chosen by our people in order to demand for a more democratic constitution, to modify 4 laws affecting our lands, minerals and chiefs, and to request the British government to grant us more political responsibility to enable us to take an active part in the management of our affairs within the framework of the British Empire.
But the reason why we opposed it was that they introduced the element of regionalism. We said if we have regionalism, then it means those from the north will feel that they are different from the south, and the south will feel likewise, and those from the east and the west, and will not have that unity of purpose.
The delegation got little response from the British government.
We felt that since Labour was in power, and Labour had promised the colonial territories that they would improve their status, that we would be received by Labour as friends. But later we found out that although that was a part of their internal politics, but that they kept to British policy not to grant independence until Britain was willing to grant same.
So the British hadn't changed their position. There was a lively public debate over the constitution. There were some who went along with it. but they were ranged against those like Azikiwe and Macaulay who saw its flaws. For them, the spot simply couldn't be washed away. The first move towards decolonization hadn't promised well for the future. By this time, there were three main political forces in the country. The NCNC was becoming increasingly identified with the interests of the East. Egbe Omo Oduduwa, later transformed into the Action Group Party, had its base in the West, and the largest Northern Cultural Association was to become the Northern People's Congress, the NPC, in 1949. These three parties, with their cultural and regional interests, were to dominate Nigerian politics in the years to come. Not surprisingly, there'd be more regional thinking in elections and in the constitutional talks. The colonial legacy was sowing its first seeds of division. After Richards, a new Governor-General decided Nigerians should be given more autonomy. This time, politicians were consulted. The Macpherson Constitution gave more powers to the regional assemblies while maintaining a central legislature. The nationalists felt the transfer of power was still too limited.
The Richards Constitution was amended, and we had Macpherson Constitution, which granted us responsibility without power. Power resided in the governor, and under the royal instructions, the governor can veto whatever the cabinet has done.
Though the Constitution was opposed in the South, it would be more widely accepted in the North, which now had equal representation in the Federal Assembly.
It gave each region, for example, the opportunity to develop in its own way, and at the same time was capable of bringing about unity, national unity in the country eventually.
And yet, the extent of Nigeria's regionalized politics was now to become clear. 1951, Nigeria's first general election. All three major parties campaigned. Each won a large majority in its area, the NPC in the north, the Action Group in the west, and the NCNC in the east. Each now had to think in terms of strategic alliances. No single party could govern alone. Party politics and options would take second place to tactical thinking.
You see, taking part in the government of the Federation at the national level brought a new problem to the Action Group. The problem was, were we to cooperate with the North or with the East? So we found ourselves on the horns of a dilemma.
In 1953, a single issue triggered party antagonisms, making the drive for independence uncertain. The northern members of the legislature felt they couldn't support a motion for self-government by 1956 because the North wasn't ready. Emotions ran high. Macpherson's constitution hadn't foreseen that the regions would differ about how much autonomy they should have. A new and lasting solution was needed. The Macpherson model would have to change.
I think that there was a crisis in Nigeria after the 1953 motion for self-government. I think looking back, some people might feel that that motion was unwise and that the southern parties should have been more willing to discuss with the Northern People's Congress and come to some kind of understanding or compromise. But having gone ahead to move the motion against the opposition of the North, the whole future of Nigeria was, as it were, put under question mark. And the only thing that could work was a very loose federation.
The Conference for a New Constitution, held in 1953 and 54, acknowledged regional divisions. The new constitution did stick to a federal framework, but each region was to have its own government, assembly, and premier. If that political autonomy was striking, the region's economic powers would be even more so. Industry would now come under regional control. So would all customs and excise duties. Produce marketing boards would be regionalized. Even the civil service and the courts would be regional matters, as would education and health. The Lagos Conference, presided over by the Colonial Secretary, Oliver Littleton, was seen as a success in London. But critics said the Constitution went much too far down the path of regionalism. Inevitably, conflicts between national and regional issues would move to the core of Nigerian politics, especially for regional representatives at the center.
Of course, there has been problem between us in the center and our counterparts in the region at that time, the ministers in the region and the ministers in the federal. The ministers at the regional level think that we are not sufficiently taking the interest of the North into consideration. Of course, we couldn't afford it. We were meant to serve the nation as a whole, and our main work was to integrate the entire Nigerian community into one.
The new constitution reflected divisions which the British had fostered, rifts which now led to personal rivalries and mistrust among politicians. And yet the colonial presence had always assumed a moral justification.
The British are not in Africa for Britain's sake alone or for Africa's sake alone. It is a complementary process. We are here to help Africans have a better standard of living, which in turn will help the British to have a better standard of living.
This now seemed hard to sustain.
The British served their interests much better than they served the interests of Nigerians. They would say that they were here to serve both interests. That's if you doubt that like I do, then you cannot say that they made a mess, because they served the interests that they came here to protect.
In the 1954 elections, under the new constitution, the NPC and its allies again won the north, while the NCNC took the east, as widely expected. These elections confirmed the pattern